officer, a man not much older than he. Abu Dari were polite people. "I've come to leave a message for Nynaeve Sedai and Elaine Sedai, or to give it to them if they've returned." The officer stared at him, looked at the stairs in consternation. Gold cord as well as green on his pointed helmet signified some rank Matt did not know, and he carried a gilded rod instead of a halberd, with a sharp end and a hook like an ox goad. By his expression, no one had ever come up that way before. Studying Matt's coat, he mulled it over visibly, and at last decided he could not tell him to go away. With a sigh, the man murmured a benison in return and asked Matt's name, pushed open a small door in one of the larger, and ushered him into a grand entry hall, encircled by 5 stone-railed balconies beneath a domed ceiling painted like the sky, complete with clouds and a sun. The guard's snapping fingers summoned a slim young serving woman in a white dress, sewn up on the left to show green petticoats and embroidered on the left breast, with a green anchor and sword. She scurried across the red and blue marble floor, looking startled, curtsying to Matt and the officer each. Short black hair framed his sweetly pretty face, with silken olive skin, and her livery had the deep, narrow neckline common to all women except nobles in Ibudar. For once, Matt did not really notice. When she heard what he wanted, her big black eyes widened even more. Aes Sedai were not unpopular in Ibudar, exactly, but most Ibudari would go a long distance out of their way to avoid one. "Yes, Sword Lieutenant," she said, bobbing again. "Of course, Sword Lieutenant." "May it please you to follow me, my lord?" It did. Outside, Ibudar sparkled white, but inside, color ran wild. There seemed to be miles of broad corridor in the palace, and here the ceiling was blue and the walls yellow, there the walls pale red and the ceiling green, changing with every turn. Combinations to jar any eye but a tinker's. Matt's boots sounded loud on the floor tiles that made patterns of 2 or 3 or sometimes 4 colors in diamonds or stars or triangles. Wherever hallways crossed, the floor was a mosaic of tiny tiles, intricate swirls and scrolls and loops. A few silk tapestries displayed scenes of the sea, and arched niches held carved crystal bowls and small statues and yellow sea-folk porcelain that would fetch a fine penny anywhere. Occasionally, a liveried servant hurried along silently, often as not carrying a silver tray or a golden. Normally, displays of wealth made Matt feel comfortable. For one thing, where there was money, some might stick to his fingers. This time he felt impatient, more so by the step, and anxious. The last time he had felt the dice rolling so hard in his head was just before he found himself with 300 of the band, 1,000 of Gabriel's white lions on a ridge to his front, and another 1,000 coming hard up the road behind him, when all he had been trying to do was ride away from the entire mess. That time he had avoided the chop by the grace of other men's memories and more luck than he had a right to. The dice almost always meant danger and something else he had not figured out yet. The prospect of having his skull cracked was not enough, and once or twice there had been no possibility of such, yet the upcoming likelihood of Matt Coffin dead in some spectacular fashion seemed the most usual cause. Unlikely, maybe, in the Tarasin Palace, but unlikely did not make the dice go away. He was going to leave his message, grab Nynaeve and Elaine by the scruff of the neck if he had an opportunity, give them a talking to that made their ears glow, and then get out. The young woman glided ahead of him until they reached a short, bullish man, a little older than she, another servant, in tight white breeches, a white shirt with wide sleeves, and a long green vest with the anchor and sword of House Mitsobar in a white disc. "Master Jen," she said, curtsying once more, "this is Lord Matt Coffin, who wishes to leave a message for the honored Elaine Aes Sedai and the honored Nynaeve Aes Sedai." "Very good, Hazel. You may go." He bowed to Matt. "May it please you to follow me, my lord?" Jen led him as far as a dark, grim-faced woman, short of her middle years, and bowed. "Mistress Karen, this is Lord Matt Coffin, who wishes to leave a message for the honored Elaine Aes Sedai and the honored Nynaeve Aes Sedai." "Very good, Jen. You may go." May it please you to follow me, my lord? Karen took him up a sweeping flight of marble stairs, the risers painted yellow and red, to a skinny woman named Matilda, who handed him over to a stout fellow named Bren, who led him to a balding man named Maddock, each a little older than the one before. Where 5 corridors met like the spokes of a wheel, Maddock left him with a round woman called Laren, who had a touch of gray at her temples and a stately carriage. Like Karen and Matilda, she wore what the Abudari called a marriage knife, hanging hilt down from a close-fitting silver necklace between more than plump breasts. 5 white stones in the hilt, 2 set in red, and 4 red stones, one surrounded by black, said 3 of her 9 children were dead, 2 sons in duels. Rising out of her curtsy to Matt, Laren began to float up one of the hallways, but he hurried to catch her arm. Dark eyebrows rose slightly as she glanced at his hand. She had no dagger except the marriage knife, but he released her immediately. Custom said she could only use that on her husband, yet there was no point in pushing. He did not soften his voice, though. How far do I have to go to leave a note? Show me to their rooms. A pair of Aes Sedai shouldn't be that hard to find. This isn't the bloody White Tower. Aes Sedai, a woman said behind him in a heavy Illianer accent. If you do seek 2 Aes Sedai, you have found 2. Laren's face did not change, or almost not. Her nearly black eyes darted past him, and he was sure they tightened with worry. Doffing his hat, Matt turned, wearing an easy smile. With that silver fox head around his neck, Aes Sedai did not put him off at all. Well, not very much. It had those flaws. Maybe the smile was not that easy. The 2 women confronting him could not have been more different. One was slender, with a fetching smile, in a gold and green dress that showed a hint of what he judged to be a fine bosom. Except for that ageless face, he might have thought to strike up a conversation. It was a pretty face, with eyes large enough for a man to sink into. A pity. The other one had the ageless face, too, but seeing it took him a moment. He thought she was scowling until he realized that must be her normal expression. Her dark, almost black dress covered her to the wrists and chin, for which he was grateful. She looked scrawny as an old bramble. She looked as if she ate brambles for breakfast. I'm trying to leave a message for Nynaeve and Elaine, he told them. This woman... He blinked, looking down each of the corridors. Servants hurried by, but Laren was nowhere in sight. He would not have thought she could move so fast. Anyway, I want to leave a note. Suddenly cautious, he added, Are you friends of theirs? Not exactly, the pretty one said. I am Jolene, and this is Teslin. And you are Matt Cawthon. Matt's stomach tightened. 9 Aes Sedai in the palace, and he had to walk into the 2 who followed Elida, and one of them red. Not that he had anything to fear. He lowered his hand to his side before it could touch the fox head under his clothes. The one who ate brambles, Teslin, stepped closer. She was a sitter, according to Tom, though what a sitter was doing here, even Tom did not understand. We would be their friends if we could. They do need friends, Master Cawthon, as do you. Her eyes tried to dig holes in his head. Jolene moved to flank him, laying a hand on his lapel. He would have considered that smile inviting from another woman. She was Green Aja. They are on dangerous ground and blind to what lies beneath their feet. I know you are their friend. You might show it by telling them to abandon this nonsense before it is too late. Foolish children who go too far can find themselves punished quite severely. Matt wanted to back away. Even Teslin stood close enough to be almost touching him. Instead, he put on his most insolent grin. It had always landed him in trouble back home, but it seemed appropriate. Those dice in his head could have nothing to do with this pair, or they would have stopped spinning. And he did have the medallion. They see pretty well, I'd say. Nynaeve badly needed to be snatched down a peg or 6, and Elaine even more, but he was not about to stand by and listen to this woman talk Nynaeve down. If that meant defending Elaine too, so be it. Maybe you should abandon your nonsense. Jolene's smile vanished, but Tesselin replaced it with one of her own, a razored smile. We do know about you, Master Cawthon. She looked a woman who wanted to skin something, and whoever was handy would do. Tavirin, it do be said, with dangerous associations of your own. That do be more than hearsay. Jolene's face was ice. A young man in your position who wished to be assured of his future could do much worse than seek the protection of the tower. You should never have left it. His stomach clenched tighter. What else did they know? Surely not about the medallion. Nynaeve and Elaine knew, and Adelius and Vandine, and the light only knew who they had told, but surely not this pair. There was worse than Tavirin or the Foxhead, though, or even Rand, as far as he was concerned. If they knew about the bloody horn. Abruptly, he was yanked away from them so hard that he stumbled and nearly dropped his hat. A slender woman with a smooth face and nearly white hair gathered at the back of her neck had him by sleeve and lapel. Reflexively, Tesselin seized him the same way on the other side. He recognized the straight-backed newcomer in her plain gray dress, in a way. She was either Adelius or Vandine, two sisters, real sisters, not just Aes Sedai, who might as well have been twins. He could never tell them apart for certain. She and Tesselin stared at one another, chill and serene, two cats with a paw on the same mouse. No need to tear my coat off, he growled, trying to shrug free. My coat? He was not sure they heard. Even wearing the Foxhead, he was not prepared to go as far as prying their fingers free, unless he had to. Two other Aes Sedai accompanied whichever sister it was, though one, a dark, stocky woman with inquisitive eyes, was marked by no more than the great serpent ring and the brown-fringed shawl she wore, displaying the white flame of Tarvalin among vines on her back. She appeared to be just a little older than Nynaeve, which made her Saritha Tomaris, only 2 years or so Aes Sedai. Do you stoop to kidnapping men in the halls now, Tesselin? The other one said. A man who cannot channel can hardly be of interest to you. Short and pale in lace-trimmed gray slashed with blue, she was all cool, ageless elegance and confident smile. Her Kyrianan accent identified her. He had certainly attracted the top dogs in the yard. Tom had not been sure whether Jolene or Tesselin was in charge of Elida's embassy, but Merlilla led the one from those idiots who had tricked Egwene into becoming their Amelin. That could have shaved with Tesselin's return smile. Do not dissemble with me, Merlilla. Matt Cawthon do be of considerable interest. He should no be running loose. As if he was not standing there listening. Don't fight over me, he said. Tugging his coat was not making anyone let go. There's enough to go around. 5 sets of eyes made him wish he had kept his mouth shut. Aes Sedai had no sense of humor. He pulled a little harder, and Vandine, or Adelius, jerked back hard enough to pull the coat out of his hand. Vandine, he decided. She was green, and he had always thought she wanted to turn him upside down and shake the secret of the medallion out of him. Whichever she was, she smiled, part knowing, part amused. He saw nothing funny. The others did not look at him long. He might as well have vanished. What he needs, Jolene said firmly, is to be taken into custody for his own protection and more. 3 Tavirin coming out of a single village, and one of them the Dragon Reborn? Master Cawthon should be sent to the White Tower immediately. And he had thought her pretty. Merlilla only shook her head. You overestimate your situation here, Jolene, if you think I will simply allow you to take the boy. You overestimate yours, Merlilla. Jolene stepped closer until she was looking down at the other woman. Her lips curved, superior and condescending. Or do you understand that it's only a wish not to offend Tylan that keeps us from confining all of you on bread and water until you can be returned to the tower? Not expecting Merlilla to laugh in her face, but she shifted her head slightly as if she really wanted to break away from Jolene's gaze. You would not dare. Saritha wore Aes Sedai tranquility like a mask, face smooth and hands calmly adjusting her shawl, but her breathy voice shouted that it was a mask. "These are children's games, Jolene," Van Deen murmured dryly. Surely that was who she was. She was the only one of the three who really did appear unruffled. Faint splashes of color blossomed on Marlilla's cheeks as if the white-haired woman had spoken to her, but her own gaze steadied. "You can hardly expect us to go meekly," she told Jolene firmly. "And there are 5 of us. 7, counting Nynaeve and Elaine." The last was a clear afterthought, and reluctant at that. Jolene arched an eyebrow. Teslin's bony fingers did not loosen their grip any more than Van Deen's, but she studied Jolene and Marlilla with an unreadable expression. Aes Sedai were a country of strangers, where you never knew what to expect until it was too late. There were deep currents here. Deep currents around Aes Sedai could snatch a man to his death without them so much as noticing. Maybe it was time to start prying at fingers. Laren's sudden reappearance saved him the effort. Struggling to control her breath, as if she had been running, the plump woman spread her skirts in a curtsy markedly deeper than she had given him. "Forgiveness for disturbing you, Aes Sedai, but the Queen summons Lord Cawthon."
I'll be right back.
"Forgiveness, please. It's more than my ears are worth if I don't bring him straight away." The Aes Sedai looked at her, all of them, till she began to fidget. Then the two groups stared at one another as if trying to see who could out-Aes Sedai who. And then they looked at him. He wondered whether anybody was going to move. "I can't keep the Queen waiting now, can I?" he said cheerily. From the sniffs, you would have thought he had pinched somebody's bottom. Even Laren's brows drew down in disapproval. "Release him, Adelius," Marlilla said finally. He frowned as the white-haired woman complied. "Those two ought to wear little signs with their names or different color hair ribbons or something." She gave him another of those amused, knowing smiles. He hated that. It was a woman's trick, not just Aes Sedai, and they usually did not know anything at all like what they wanted you to believe. "Teslin?" he said. The grim red still had hold of his coat with both hands. She peered up at him, ignoring everyone else. "The Queen?" Marlilla opened her mouth and hesitated, obviously changing what she had been going to say. "How long do you intend to stand here holding him, Teslin? Perhaps you will try to explain to Tylan why her summons is disregarded." "Consider well who you do tie yourself to, Master Cawthon," Teslin said, still looking only at him. "Wrong choices can lead to an unpleasant future, even for a Taviran. Consider well." Then she let go. As he followed Laren, he did not allow himself to show his eagerness to be away, but he did wish the woman would walk a little faster. She glided along ahead of him, regal as any queen, regal as any Aes Sedai. When they reached the first turning, he looked over his shoulder. The 5 Aes Sedai were still standing there, staring after him. As if his look had been a signal, they exchanged silent glances and went, each in a different direction. Adelius came toward him, but a dozen steps before reaching him, she smiled at him again and disappeared through a doorway. Deep currents. He preferred swimming where his feet could touch the bottom of the pond. Laren was waiting around the corner, hands on broad hips and her face much too smooth. Beneath her skirts, he suspected her foot was tapping impatiently. He gave her his most winning smile. Giggling girls or gray-haired grandmothers, women softened for that one. It had won him kisses and eased him out of predicaments more often than he could count. It was almost as good as flowers. "That was neatly done, and I thank you. I'm sure the Queen doesn't really want to see me." If she did, he did not want to see her. Everything he thought about nobles was tripled for royalty. Nothing he had found in those old memories changed that. And some of those fellows had spent considerable time around kings and queens and the like. "Now, if you will just show me where Nynaeve and Elaine stay." Strangely, the smile did not seem to have any effect. "I would not lie, Lord Cawthon. It would be more than my ears are worth. The Queen is waiting, my lord." You are a very brave man, she added, turning, then said something more under her breath. Or a very great fool. He doubted he had been supposed to hear that. A choice between going to see the Queen and wandering miles up corridor until he stumbled on somebody who would tell him what he wanted to know. He went to see the Queen. Tylin Quintara, by the grace of the light, Queen of Altara, Mistress of the Four Winds, Guardian of the Sea of Storms, High Seat of House Mitsubar, awaited him in a room with yellow walls and a pale blue ceiling, standing before a huge white fireplace with a stone lintel carved into a stormy sea. She was well worth seeing, he decided. Tylin was not young. The shiny black hair cascading over her shoulders had gray at the temples, and faint lines webbed the corners of her eyes.
Sure tell.
Nor was she exactly pretty, though the two thin scars on her cheeks had nearly vanished with age. Handsome came closer, but she was imposing. Large dark eyes regarded him majestically, an eagle's eyes. She had little real power. A man could ride beyond her writ in 2 or 3 days and still have a lot of Altara ahead. But he thought she might even make an Aes Sedai step back. Like Isabella of Dal Kalain, who had made the Amerlin Angara come to her. That was one of the old memories. Dal Kalain had vanished in the Trolloc Wars. Majesty, he said, sweeping his hat wide in a bow and flourishing an imaginary cloak, by your summons do I come. Imposing or not, it was hard to keep his eyes away from the not small lace-trimmed oval where her white-sheathed marriage knife hung. A very nicely rounded sight indeed. Yet the more bosom a woman displayed, the less she wanted you to look. Openly. White sheath. But he already knew she was a widow. Not that it mattered. He would as soon tangle himself with that fox-faced dark friend as with a queen. Not looking at all was difficult, but he managed. Most likely she would call guards rather than draw the gem-encrusted dagger thrust behind a woven gold belt to match the collar her marriage knife hung from. Maybe that was why the dice were still rolling in his head. The possibility of an encounter with the headsman would set them spinning if anything did. Layered silk petticoats rippled white and yellow as she crossed the room and walked slowly all the way around him. You speak the old tongue, she said, once she stood in front of him again. Her voice was low-pitched and musical. Without waiting for a reply, she glided to a chair and sat, adjusting her green skirts. An unconscious gesture, her gaze remained fixed on him. He thought she could probably tell when his small clothes had been washed last. You wish to leave a message? I have what is necessary. A lace fall at her wrist swayed as she gestured to a small writing table standing beneath a gilt-framed mirror. All the furnishings were gilded and carved like bamboo. Tall, triple-arched windows opening onto a wrought iron balcony admitted a sea breeze that was surprisingly pleasant, if not exactly cool. Yet Matt felt hotter than in the street, and it had nothing to do with her stare. De yenayi, view ninte consion calietje. That was what he had said. The bloody old tongue popping out of his mouth again, without him knowing it. He had thought he had that little bother under control. No telling when those bloody dice would stop, or for what. Best to keep his eyes to himself and his mouth shut as much as possible. I thank you, Majesty. He made very sure of those words. Thick sheets of pale paper already waited on the slanted table, at a comfortable height for writing. He propped his hat against the table leg. He could see her in the mirror, watching. Why had he let his tongue run loose? Dipping a golden pen, what else would a queen have? He composed what he wanted to write in his head before bending over the paper, his arm curled around it. His hand was awkward and square. He had no love of writing. I followed a dark friend to the palace Jakin Karadin is renting. She tried to kill me once, and maybe ran as well. She was greeted like an old friend of the house. For a moment, he studied that, biting the end of the pen before realizing he was scoring the soft gold. Maybe Tylin would not notice. They needed to know about Carden. What else? He added a few more reasonably worded lines. The last thing he wanted to do was put their backs up. Be sensible. If you have to go traipsing around, let me send a few men along to keep you from having your head split open. Anyway, isn't it about time I took you back to Egwene? There's nothing here but heat and flies, and we can find plenty of those in Camelin. There. They could not ask for pleasanter than that. Blotting the page carefully, he folded it 4 times. Sand in a small golden bowl covered a coal. He puffed on it till it glowed, then used it to light a candle and picked up the stick of red wax. As the sealing wax dripped onto the edges of the paper, it suddenly struck him that he had a signet ring in his pocket. Just something the ringmaker had carved to show his skill, but better than a plain lump. The ring was slightly longer than the pool of solidifying wax, yet most of the sigil took. For the first time, he got a good look at what he had bought. Inside a border of large crescents, a running fox seemed to have startled 2 birds into flight. That made him grin. Too bad it was not a hand. But appropriate enough. He certainly needed to be crafty as a fox to keep up with my lane. And if they were not exactly flighty, well... Besides, the medallion had made him fond of foxes. He scrawled Nynaeve's name on the outside, and then Elaine's, as an afterthought. One or the other, they should see it soon. Turning with the sealed letter held in front of him, he gave a start as his knuckles brushed against Tylan's bosom. He stumbled back against the writing table, staring and trying not to turn red. Staring at her face. Just her face. He had not heard her approach. Just ignore the brushing, not embarrass her any further. As clumsy about as it was. There is something in this you should know, Majesty. Insufficient room remained between them to lift the letter. Jacob Carradine is entertaining dark friends, and I don't mean arresting them. You are certain? Of course you are. No one would make that charge without being certain. A furrow creased her brow, but she gave her head a shake, and the frown disappeared. Let us speak of more pleasant things. He yelped. He told her the White Cloak ambassador to her court was a dark friend, and all she did was grimace. You are Lord Matt Coffin? There was just a hint of question in the title. Her eyes minded him more than ever of an eagle's. A queen could not like someone coming to her pretending to be a lord. Just Matt Coffin. Something told him she would hear a lie. Besides, letting people think he was a lord was one he would rather miss without. In Abu Dar, you could find a duel anytime you turned around, but few challenged lords except other lords. As it was, in the last month, he had cracked a number of heads, bloodied 4 men, and run half a mile to escape a woman. Highland's stare made him nervous, and those dice still rattled about in his skull. He wanted out of here. If you'll tell me where to leave the letter, Majesty. The daughter heir and Nynaeve Sedai seldom mention you, she said, but one learns to hear what is not said. Casually, she reached up and touched his cheek. He half raised his own hand uncertainly. Had he smeared ink there, chewing the pen? Women did like to tidy things, including men. Maybe queens did, too. What they do not say, but I hear, is that you are an untamed rogue, a gambler and chaser after women. Her eyes held his, expression never altering a hair, and her voice stayed firm and cool. But as she spoke, her fingers stroked his other cheek. Untamed men are often the most interesting to talk to. A finger outlined his lips. An untamed rogue who travels with Aes Sedai. A Taviran who, I think, makes them a little afraid. Uneasy, at the least. It takes a man with a strong liver to make Aes Sedai uneasy. How will you bend the pattern in Abu Dar, just Matt Coffin? Her hand settled against his neck. He could feel his pulse throbbing against her fingers. His mouth fell open. The writing table behind his back rattled against the wall as he tried to back away. The only way out was to push her aside or climb over her skirts. Women did not behave this way. Oh, some of those old memories suggested they did, but it was mainly memories of memories that that woman had done this or this woman had done that. The things he recalled clearly were battles for the most part, and no help here at all. She smiled, a faint curl of her lips that did not lessen the predatory gleam in her eyes. The hair on his head tried to stand up. Her eyes flickered over his shoulder to the mirror, and she turned abruptly, leaving him gaping at her back as she moved away. "I must arrange to speak with you again, Master Cawthon. She cut off as the door swung all the way open, apparently surprised, but then he realized she had seen it begin moving in the mirror. A slender young man entered, limping slightly. A dark lad with sharp eyes that flicked by Matt with barely a pause. Black hair hung to his shoulders, and he wore one of those coats that was never meant to be worn normally draped across his shoulders, green silk with a gold chain across his chest and gold leopards worked in the lapels. "Mother," he said, bowing to Tylan and touching his lips with his fingers. "Beslin." She filled the name with warmth and kissed him on both cheeks and his eyelids. The firm, even icy tone she had used with Matt might as well have never been. "It went well, I thought." "Not as well as it might," the boy sighed. Despite his eyes, he had a mild manner to him and a soft voice. "Nevin nicked my leg on the second pass, then slipped on the third, so I ran him through the heart instead of his sword arm. The offense was not worth killing, and now I must pay condolences to his widow." He seemed to regret that as much as this Nevin's death. Tylan's beaming face hardly seemed right on a woman whose son had just told her he had killed a man. "Just be sure your visit is brief. Stab my eyes, but Dervindra will be one of those widows who wants comforting. And then you will either have to marry her or kill her brothers." By her tone, the first turned much the worse, the second merely a nuisance. "This is Master Matt Cawthon, my son. He is Taviran. I hope you'll make a friend of him. Perhaps you two will go to the Swovan night dances together." Matt jumped. The last thing he wanted was to go anywhere with a fellow who fought duels and whose mother wanted to stroke Matt Cawthon's cheek. "I am not much for balls," he said quickly. Abu Dari liked festivals beyond reason. Here High Chasling was just past, and they had 5 more in the next week. 2 all-day affairs, not just the simpler evening feasts. "I do my dancing in taverns. The rougher sort, I'm afraid. Nothing you'd like." "I favor taverns of the rougher sort," Beslin said with a smile, in that soft voice. "The balls are for older people, and they're pretties." After that, it was all downhill on crumpling shingle. Before Matt knew what was happening, Tylan had him sewed up in a sack. He and Beslin would be attending the festivals together. All of the festivals. Hunting, Beslin called it, and when Matt said hunting for girls without thinking, he would never have said that in front of somebody's mother had he thought. The boy laughed and said, "A girl or a fight, pouting lips or a flashing blade. Whichever dance you're dancing at the moment is always the most fun. Wouldn't you say so, Matt?" Tylan smiled at Beslin fondly. Matt managed a weak laugh. This Beslin was mad. Him and his mother both. Chapter 17. The Triumph of Logic. Matt stalked out of the palace when Tylan finally let him go, and had he thought it would do any good, he would have run. The skin between his shoulder blades prickled so he almost forgot the dice dancing in his head. The worst moment, the very worst of a dozen bad, had been when Beslin teased his mother, saying she should find herself a pretty for the balls, and Tylan laughingly claimed the queen had no time for young men, all the while looking at Matt with those bloody eagle's eyes. Now he knew why rabbits ran so fast. He stepped across Mulhara Square, not seeing anything. Had Nynaeve and Elaine been cavorting with Jacob Carden and Elida in the fountain beneath that statue of some long-dead queen, 2 spans or more tall and pointing to the sea, he would have passed by without a second look. The common room of the Wandering Woman was dim and comparatively cool after the bright heat outside. He took off his hat gratefully. A faint haze of pipe smoke hung in the air, but the arabesque-carved shutters across the wide-arched windows let in more than enough light. Some bedraggled pine branches had been tied above the windows for a Swovan night. In one corner, two women with flutes and a fellow with a small drum between his knees provided a shrill, pulsing sort of music that Matt had come to like. Even at this time of the day, there were a few patrons, outland merchants in moderately plain woolens, with a sprinkling of Abu Dari, most in the vests of various guilds. No apprentices or even journeymen here. So close to the palace, the wandering woman was hardly an inexpensive place to drink or eat, much less sleep. The rattle of dice at a table in the corner echoed the feel in his head, but he turned the other way, where three of his men sat on benches around him. Koravin, a muscled Karianan with a nose that made his eyes seem even smaller than they were, sat stripped to the waist, holding his tattooed arms over his head, while Vannin wound strips of bandage around his middle. Vannin was 3 times Koravin's size, but he looked like a balding sack of suet overflowing his bench. His coat appeared to have been slept in for a week. It always did, even an hour after one of the serving women ironed it. Some of the merchants eyed the three uneasily, but none of the Abu Dari. Men or women, they had seen the same or worse, often. Arnon, a lantern-jawed tyrant file leader with a crude tattoo of a hawk on his left cheek, was berating Koravin. "Don't care what the flaming fish seller said, you goat-spawned toad. You use your bloody club and don't go accepting flaming challenges just because..." He cut off when he said that and tried to look as if he had been saying what he had. He had a toothache. If Matt asked, it would turn out Koravin had slipped and fallen on his own dagger or some such foolery Matt was supposed to pretend to believe. So he just leaned his fists on the table as if he saw nothing out of the ordinary. Truth to tell, it was not that out of the ordinary. Vannin was the only man who had not been in 24 scrapes already. For some reason, men looking for trouble walked as wide of Vannin as they did an Elysian. The only difference was that Vannin seemed to like it that way. Has Tom or Julian been here yet? Vannin did not look up from tying the bandages. Haven't seen hide, hair, and a toenail. Elysian was in for a bit, though. There was no my lord nonsense from Vannin. He made no bones about not liking nobles, with the unfortunate exception of Elaine. Left an iron-strapped chest up in your room and went out blabbing about trinkets. He made as if to spit through the gap in his teeth, then glanced at one of the serving women and did not. Mistress Annan was definitely spitting on the floors, or tossing bones, or even chopping out a pipe. "The boy's out back in the stable," he went on before Matt commenced, "with his book and one of the innkeeper's daughters. Another of the girls spanked his bottom for pinching hers." Finishing the last knot, he gave Matt an accusatory look, as if it had been his fault in some way. "Poor little mite," Koravin muttered, twisting to see whether the bandages would stay in place. He had a leopard and a boar inked on one arm, a lion and a woman on the other. The woman did not seem to be wearing much except her hair. Sniveling he was, though he did brighten when Laral let him hold her hand. The men all looked after Oliver like a gang of uncles. What no mother would want near her. "He'll live," probably. The boy was probably picking up these habits from his uncles. Next, they would give him a tattoo. At least Oliver had not stepped out to the street children. He seemed to enjoy that almost as much as he did making himself nuisance with young women. "Arnon, you wait here, and if you see Tom or Julian, collar them. Vannin, I want you to see what you can learn around the Chelsea Palace, over near the 3 Towers gate."
Doing all right. Just
hesitating, he looked over the room.
How
Serving
you
women
doing?
drifted in and out of the kitchens with food and, more often, drink. Most of the patrons seemed intent on their silver cups, though a pair of women in weavers' vests argued quietly, ignoring their wine punch and leaning across the table at one another. Some of the merchants appeared to be haggling, waving hands and dipping fingers in their drinks to scribble numbers on the table. The music should mask his words from eavesdroppers, but he lowered his voice anyway. News that Jacob Carradine had dark friends coming to call screwed Bannon's round face into a scowl, as if he might spit no matter who saw. Arnon muttered something about filthy white cloaks, and Korriban suggested denouncing
Hell yeah.
Arnon to the civil guard. That got such disgusted looks from the other two that he buried his face in a cup of ale. He was one of the few men Matt knew who could drink Abudari ale in this heat, or drink it at all, for that matter. Be careful, Matt warned when Bannon stood. It was not that he was worried, really. Bannon moved with surprising lightness for such a fat man. He was the best horse thief in 2 countries at the least, and could slip by even a warder unseen. But they're a nasty lot. White cloaks or dark friends, either one. The man only grunted and motioned for Korriban to gather his shirt and coat and come along. "My lord," Arnon said as they left. "My lord, I heard there was a fog in the Rahad yesterday." On the point of turning away, Matt stopped. Arnon looked worried, and nothing much worried him.
I got a bowl pack, but
What do you
it's a
mean,
bowl of
a fog?
roaches.
In this heat, fog thick as porridge.
I
would
do
not
another
last a
dab,
hunt.
though, first.
The file eater shrugged uncomfortably and peered into his mug. "A fog. I heard there was things in it." He looked up at Matt. "I heard people just disappeared. And some was found eaten. Parts of them." Matt managed not to shiver. "The fog's gone, isn't it? You weren't in it. Worry when you are. That's all you can do." Arnon frowned doubtfully, but that was the pure truth. These bubbles of evil, that was what Rand had called them, what Moraine had, burst where and when they chose, and there did not seem to be anything even Rand could do to stop them. Worrying about it did as much good as worrying about whether a roof tile would fall on your head in the street tomorrow. Less, since you could decide to stay indoors. There was something that was worth worrying over, though. Nalesian had left their winnings sitting upstairs. Bloody nobles tossed gold around like water. Leaving Harnan studying his mug, Matt headed for the railless stairs at the back of the room. But before he reached them, one of the serving women accosted him. Kyra was a slender, full-lipped girl with smoky eyes. "A man came in looking for you, my lord," she said, twisting her skirts from side to side and looking up at him through long lashes. There was a certain smokiness in her voice, too. "Said he was an illuminator, but he looked seedy to me. He ordered a meal and left when Mistress Annan wouldn't give it. He wanted you to pay." "Next time, Pigeon, give the meal," he told her, slipping a silver mark into the plunging neck of her dress. "I'll speak to Mistress Annan." He did want to find an illuminator, a real one, not some fellow selling fireworks full of sawdust. But it hardly mattered now. Not with the gold lying unguarded. And fogs in the Rahad, and dark friends, and Aes Sedai, and bloody Tylan taking leave of her senses, and... Kyra giggled and twisted like a stroked cat. "Would you like me to bring some punch to your room, my lord? Or anything?" She smiled hopefully, invitingly. "Maybe later," he said, tapping her nose with a fingertip. She giggled again. She always did. Kyra would have her skirt sewn to show petticoats to the middle of her thigh or higher, had Mistress Annan allowed it. But the innkeeper looked after her serving women almost as closely as she did her daughters. Almost. Maybe later. Trotting up the wide stone stairs, he put Kyra out of his mind. What was he to do about all of her? The boy would find himself in real trouble one day if he thought he could treat women that way. He was going to have to keep him away from Harnan and the others as much as possible, he supposed. They were a bad influence on a boy. To have this on top of everything else. He had to get Nynaeve and Elaine out of Abu Dar before something worse went wrong. His room was at the front, with windows overlooking the square, and as he reached for the door, the hallway floor behind him squeaked. In 100 tons, it would not even have registered. But the floors in the Wandering Woman did not squeak. He looked back and spun just in time to drop his hat and catch the descending truncheon with his left hand instead of his skull. The blow stung his hand to numbness, but he held on desperately as thick fingers dug into his throat, forcing him back against the door to his room. His head hit with a thump. Silver-rimmed black spots danced in his vision, obscuring his sweating face. All he could really see was a big nose and yellow teeth, and those seemed hazy. Suddenly he realized he was on the far edge of consciousness. Those fingers were closing off blood to his brain along with air. His free hand went beneath his coat, fumbling over the hilts of his knives as though his fingers no longer remembered what they were for. The cudgel wrenched free. He could see it rising, feel it rising to smash his skull. Focusing everything, he jerked the knife from its scabbard and thrust. His attacker let out a high-pitched scream, and Matt was vaguely aware of the club bouncing off his shoulder as it fell to the floor, but the man did not let go of his throat. Stumbling, Matt drove him back, tearing at the clutching fingers with one hand, driving his knife repeatedly with the other. Abruptly, the fellow fell, sliding from Matt's blade. The knife nearly followed him to the floor. So did Matt. Gulping breath, sweet air, he clung to something, a doorway, to hold himself on his feet. From the floor, a plain-faced man stared up at him with eyes that would never see anything again. A heavy-set fellow with curled Mirandian mustaches, in a dark blue coat, fit for a small merchant or a prosperous shopkeeper. Not the look of a thief about him at all. Abruptly, he realized they had stumbled through an open door in their fight. It was a smaller room than Matt's, windowless, a pair of oil lamps on small tables beside the narrow bed providing a murky illumination. A lanky, pale-haired man straightened from a long open chest, staring oddly at the corpse. The chest took up most of the free space in the room. Matt opened his mouth to apologize for intruding so roughly, and the lanky man snatched a long dagger from his belt, a cudgel from the bed, and leaped over the chest at him. That had not been the look you give a dead stranger. Clinging unsteadily to the doorframe, Matt threw underhanded, the hilt no sooner leaving his hand than he was scrabbling under his coat for another. His knife struck squarely in the other man's throat, and Matt almost fell again, this time from relief, as the man clutched himself, blood spurting between his fingers, and toppled backward into the open chest. "It's good to be lucky," Matt croaked. Staggering, he retrieved his knife, wiping it clean on the fellow's gray coat. A better coat than the other, still wool, but of a better cut. A lesser lord would not have been ashamed to wear it. Andrin by the collar. He sank onto the bed, frowning at the man sprawled in the chest. A noise made him look up. His manservant was in the doorway, trying unsuccessfully to hide a large black iron frying pan behind his back. Nerim kept a full set of pots, and everything else he thought a lord's servant might need traveling, in the small room he shared with Oliver next to Matt's. He was short, even for a Carianan, and skinny to boot. "My lord has blood on his coat again, I fear," he murmured in melancholy tones. The day he scented anything else, the sun would rise in the west. "I do wish my lord would be more careful of his clothes. It is so hard to remove blood without a stain, and the insects hardly need any encouragement to eat holes. This place has more insects than I have ever seen, my lord."
Tropical grape.
No mention
And
at
it's
all
nice
of
indica.
2 dead men, or what he had intended with the frying pan. That scream had drawn other attention. The wandering woman was not the sort of thing where screams passed unmarked. Feet pounded in the hallway, and Mistress Annan pushed Nerim firmly out of her way and raised her skirts to step around the corpse on the floor. Her husband followed her in, a square-faced, gray-haired man with the double earring of the ancient and honorable League of the Nets dangling from his left ear. The 2 white stones on the lower hoop said he owned other boats beside the one he captained. Jasper Annan was part of the reason Matt was careful not to smile too much at any of Mistress Annan's daughters. The man wore a work knife stuffed behind his belt, and a longer curved blade,
Really
too,
good flavor.
and his long blue and green
It's
vest
good.
revealed arms and chest crisscrossed with dueling scars. He was alive. Most of the men who had given those scars were not. The other reason for caution was Satala Annan herself. Matt had never before let himself be turned off a girl because of her mother, even if that mother owned the inn where he was staying. But Mistress Annan had a way about her. While gold hoops in her ears swung as she surveyed the dead men without a flinch. She was pretty despite a touch of gray in her hair, and her marriage knife nestled in roundness that normally would have drawn his eyes like moths to a candle. Yet looking at her that way would have been like looking at, not his mother. At an Aes Sedai, maybe, though he had done that, of course, just to look. Or at Queen Tylan. The light helped him there. Putting a finger on why was not easy. She simply had a way about her. It was just difficult to think of doing anything that would offend Satala Anand. One of them jumped me in the hall. Matt kicked the chest lightly, and a hollow sound despite the dead man's slouching with his arms and legs dangling out. This is empty, except for him. I think they meant to fill it with whatever they could steal. The gold, perhaps.
Be right back.
Not likely they could have heard of that, one only hours ago, but he would ask Mistress Anand about a safer place to keep it. She nodded calmly, hazel eyes serene. Men knifed in her end did not ruffle her feathers. They insisted on carrying it up themselves. Their stock, so they claimed. They took the room just before you came in. For a few hours, they said, to sleep before traveling on toward Norchasen. That was a small village on the coast to the east, but it was unlikely they would have told the truth. Her tone implied as much. She frowned at the dead men as though wishing she could shake them alive to answer questions. They were picky about the room, though. The pale-haired man was in charge. He turned down the first 3 he was offered, then accepted this that was meant for a single servant. I thought he was being stingy with a coin. Even a thief can be tight-fisted, Matt said absently. This could have qualified to start those dice rolling in his head. A head that would have been cracked open for sure without the luck of that fellow stepping on the one board in the whole inn that would squeak. But the bloody things were still tumbling. He did not like it. You think it was chance, then, my lord? What else? She had no answer, but she frowned at the corpses again. Maybe she was not so sanguine as he had thought. She was not native to Ebudar, after all. Too many roughs in the city of late. Jasper had a deep voice, and speaking normally, he seemed to be barking commands on a fishing boat. Maybe you ought to think on hiring guards. All Mistress Anand did was lift an eyebrow, but his hands rose defensively. Peace be on you, wife. I spoke without thinking. Ebudari women were known to express displeasure with a husband in a sharp fashion. It was not beyond possibility that a few of his scars came from her. That marriage knife had several uses. Thanking the light he was not married to an Ebudari, Matt replaced his own knife in its sheath alongside the others. Thank the light he was not married at all. His fingers brushed paper. Mistress Anand was not letting her husband off easily. You frequently do, husband, she said, fingering the hilt between her breasts. Many women would not let it pass. Elinda always tells me I'm not firm enough when you speak out of line.
Excellent flavor.
I need to provide a good example for my daughters. The celebrity melted into a smile. Consider yourself chastised. I will refrain from telling you who should hold which plate on which boat. You are too kind to me, wife, he replied dryly. There was no guild for innkeepers in Ebudar, but every inn in the city was in the hands of a woman. To Ebudari, bad luck of the worst sort would dog any inn owned by a man, or any vessel owned by a woman. There were no women in the Fishermen's Guild. Matt pulled out the paper. It was snowy white, expensive, and stiff, and folded small. The few lines on it were printed in square letters, like those Alver might use. For an adult who did not want the hand recognition. Elaine and Nynaeve are pushing too far. Remind them they are still in danger from the tower. Warn them to be careful, or they will be kneeling to ask Elida's pardon yet. That was all. No signature. Still in danger? That suggested it was nothing new, and somehow it did not fit with them being snared up by the rebels. No, that was the wrong question. Who had slipped him this note? Obviously somebody who thought they could not simply hand it to him. Who had had the opportunity since he put the coat on this morning? It had not been there then, for sure. Somebody who had gotten close. Somebody. Unbidden, he found himself humming a snatch of "She dazzles my eyes and clouds my mind." Around here, the tune had different words. They called it "Upside Down" and "Round and Round." Only Teslin or Jolene fit. That was impossible. "Bad news, my lord?" Mistress Annan asked. Matt stuffed the note into his pocket. "Does any man ever get to understand women? I don't mean just Aes Sedai. Any women." Jasper roared, and when his wife directed a meaning gaze his way, he only laughed harder. The look she gave Matt would have shamed an Aes Sedai for its perfect serenity. "Men have it quite easy, my lord, if they only looked or listened. Women have the difficult task. We must try to understand men." Jasper took hold of the doorframe, tears rolling down his dark face. She eyed him sideways, tilting her head, then turned, all cool calmness, and punched him under the ribs with her fist so hard that his knees buckled. His laughter took on a wheeze without stopping. "There is a saying in Ebudar, my lord," she said to Matt over her shoulder. "A man is a maze of brambles and darkness, and even he does not know the way." Matt snorted. Fat lot of help she was. Well, Teslin or Jolene or somebody else. It must have been somebody else, if he could only think who. The one was a long way away. Jacob Cardin was right here. He found it, the two corpses. And so were 100 other scoundrels. Somehow, you would see those two women safely out of Ebudar. The trouble was, he did not have a clue how. He wished those bloody dice would stop and be done with it.
The apartments Jolene shared with Teslin were quite spacious, including a bedchamber for each of them, plus one apiece for their maids, and another that would have done quite well for Blarick and Fen, if Teslin could have stood to have her warders with them. The woman saw every man as a potentially rabid wolf, and there was no gainsaying her when she truly wanted something. As inexorable as Elida, she ground down whatever lay in her path. They stood as equals in every real way, certainly, but not many managed to prevail over Teslin without a clear advantage. She was at the writing table in the sitting room when Jolene entered, her pen making an awful scritch, scritch. She was always parsimonious with the ink. Without a word, Jolene swept by her and out onto the balcony, a long cage of white-painted iron. The scroll work was so tight that the men working in the garden 3 stories below would have a difficult time seeing that there was anyone within. Flowers in this region ordinarily thrived in heat, wild colors to outshine the interior of the palace, but nothing bloomed down there. Gardeners moved along the gravel walks with buckets of water, yet nearly every leaf was yellow or brown. She would not have admitted it under torture, but the heat made her afraid. The Dark One was touching the world, and their only hope a boy who was running wild. "Bread and water?" Teslin said suddenly. "Send the Cawthon boy off to the tower? If there do be changes in what we did plan, you will please inform me before telling others." Jolene felt a touch of heat in her cheeks. "Marililla needed to be set down. She lectured when I was a novice. So had Teslin, a severe teacher who held her classes with an iron grip. Just the way she spoke was a reminder, a marked warning not to go against her, equal or not. Marililla, though, stood lower. She used to make us stand in front of the class, and she would dig and dig for the answer she wanted until we stood there in front of everyone weeping with frustration. She pretended to sympathize, or perhaps she really did, but the more she patted us and told us not to cry, the worse it was." She cut off abruptly. She had not intended to say all that. It was Teslin's fault. always looking at her as if she were about to be abraded for a spot on her dress. But she should understand. Marililla had taught her, too. You have remembered that all this time? Stark incredulity painted Teslin's voice. The sisters who did teach us did only do their duty. Sometimes I do think what Elida did say of you do be right. The annoying scritch resumed. It simply came to mind when Marililla began as if she were truly an ambassador, instead of a rebel. Jolene frowned at the garden. She despised every one of those women who had broken the White Tower and wanted the break before others, them and anyone who aided them. But Elida had blundered too, horribly. The sisters who were rebels now could have been reconciled with a little effort. What did she say of me? Teslin? The sound of the pen continued, like fingernails scraping across a slate. Jolene went back inside. What did Elida say? Teslin laid another sheet atop her letter, either to blot or to shield it from Jolene's eyes, but she did not answer immediately. She scowled at Jolene, or perhaps just looked. It was difficult to say with her at times, and at last sighed. Very well, if you must know. She did say you still do be a child. A child? Jolene's shock had no effect on the other woman. Some, Teslin said calmly, do change little from the day they do put on novice classes. Some do change no at all. Elida does believe you have no grown up yet, and never will. Jolene tossed her head angrily, unwilling to let herself speak. To have that said by someone whose mother had been a child when she herself gained the shawl. Elida had been petted too much as a novice, made over too much for her strength and the remarkable speed of her learning. Jolene suspected that was why she was in such a fury about Elaine and Egwene and the wilder Nynaeve, because they were stronger than she, because they had spent far less time as novices, no matter that they had been pushed ahead too fast. Why, Nynaeve had never been a novice at all, and that was completely unheard of. Since you did bring it up, Teslin went on, perhaps we should try to take advantage of the situation. What do you mean? Embracing the true source, Jolene channeled air to lift the silver pitcher on the turquoise-inlaid side table and fill a silver goblet with punch. As always, the joy of embracing Saidar thrilled her, soothing even as it exhilarated. It do be obvious, I should think. Elida's orders do still stand. Elaine and Nynaeve are to be returned to the tower as soon as found. I did agree to wait, but perhaps we should wait no longer. A pity the Alvear girl does no be with them, but two will put us back in Elida's good graces, and if we can add the Cawthon boy, I do think those three will make her welcome us as if we did come with Althor himself, and this Avienda will make a fine novice, wilder or no. The goblet floated into Jolene's hand on air, and she reluctantly released the power. She had never lost the ardor she felt the first time she touched the source. Dew melon punch was a poor substitute for Saidar. The worst part of her penance before leaving the tower had been losing the right to touch Saidar. Almost the worst part. She had said it all herself, but Elida had made it clear that if she did not make it harsh, Elida would. She had no doubt the result would have been much worse then. Her good graces? Teslin, she humiliated us for no more reason than to show the others that she could. She sent us to this fly-ridden hole as far from everything important as she could, short of the other side of the Arth Ocean, ambassadors to a queen with less power than a dozen of her own nobles, any one of whom could snatch the throne from her tomorrow if they could be bothered to. And you want to wheedle your way back into Elida's favor? She do be the Amelin seat. Teslin touched the letter with the page lying atop it, moving the sheets a bit this way, then a bit that, as if framing her thoughts. Remaining silent for a time did let her know we are no lapdogs, but remaining silent too long could be seen as treason. Jolene sniffed. Ridiculous. When they're returned, they'll only be punished for running away, and now for pretending to be full sisters. Her mouth tightened. They were both guilty there, and those who allowed them to as well. But it made a sharp difference when one of them claimed her own Aja. By the time the Green Aja finished with Elaine for that, it would be a very chastened young woman indeed who took the throne of Andor. Though it might be best if Elaine secured the Lion Throne first. Her training had to be completed either way. Jolene did not intend to see Elaine lost to the tower, whatever she had done. Do no forget joining with the rebels. Light, Teslin. They were probably scooped up just like the girls the rebels took out of the tower. Does it really matter a whit whether they begin mucking out stalls tomorrow or next year? That was surely as much as the novices and accepted with the rebels would have to face. Even the Ajas can wait to have them in hand, really. It is not as if they aren't safe. They are accepted, after all, and they certainly seem content to stay where we can reach them whenever we choose. I say let us sit where Elida put us and continue to fold our hands and hold our tongues until she asks nicely to find out what we are doing. She did not say that she was prepared to wait until Elida found herself deposed as Swan had been. The Hall surely would not put up with the bullying and bungling forever, but Teslin was red, after all, and would not appreciate hearing that. I suppose there do be no urgency, Teslin said slowly, the unspoken but all but shouting itself. Drawing a ball-footed chair to the table with another flow of air, Jolene settled herself to convincing her companion that silence remained the best policy. Still a child, was she? If she had her way, Elida would not get so much as a word out of Ebudar until she begged for it. The woman on the table arched up as far as her bonds would allow, eyes bulging, throat corded with a piercing scream that went on and on. Abruptly, the scream was a loud, choking rasp instead, and she convulsed, shaking from wrists to ankles, then collapsed in silence, while her eyes stared sightlessly at the cobwebbed basement ceiling. Giving vent to curses was irrational, but Phalion could have turned the air as blue as any stableman. Not for the first time she wished she had Tamila here instead of Ispan. Questions were answered eagerly for Tamila, and nobody died until she was ready. Of course, Tamila enjoyed the work entirely too much, but that was beside the point. Channeling once more, Phalion gathered the woman's clothes from the filthy floor and dropped them atop the body. The red leather belt fell off, and she snatched it up by hand and slapped it back onto the pile. Perhaps she should have used other methods, but straps and pincers and hot irons were so messy. Leave the body in an alley somewhere. Slit the throat so it looks as if she was dead. You can keep the clothes in your purse. The two men, squatting on their heels against the stone wall, exchanged looks. Arnin and Nad might have been brothers by their appearance, all black hair and beady eyes and scars, with more muscles than any three men could need, but they did have sufficient brains to carry out simple orders, usually. Forgiveness, mistress, Arnin said hesitantly, but no one will believe. Do as you are told, she snapped, channeling to haul him to his feet and slam him back against the stones. His head bounced, yet that surely could do him no danger. Nad rushed to the table, babbling, Yes, mistress, as you command, mistress. When she released Arnin, he did not babble, but he staggered over without any more objections to help gather up the body like so much rubbish and carry it out. Well, it was so much rubbish now. She regretted the outburst. Letting temper take control was irrational. It did seem to be effective at times, though. After all these years, that still surprised her. Oh, Gideon, she will not like this, Ispan said as soon as the men had gone. The blue and green beads that were worked into her many slim black braids clacked as she shook her head. She had remained in the shadows the whole time, in a corner, with a small ward woven so she could not hear. Phalion managed not to glare. Ispan was the last companion she would have chosen for herself. She was blue, or had been. Perhaps she still was. Phalion did not really think herself any less white Aja because she had joined the black. Blues were too fervent, tying emotion around what should be viewed with utter dispassion. Rihanna, another white, would have been her choice, though the woman did have odd, unsound notions on several points of logic. Mogideon has forgotten us, Ispan. Or have you received some private word from her? In any case, I am convinced this cache does not exist. Mogideon, she said, that it does. Ispan began firmly, but her voice quickly grew warm. More of Angreal and Saangreal and Turangreal. We will have some part of them. Angreal of our very own Thalion. Perhaps even Saangreal. She has promised. Mogedion was wrong. Thalion watched shock widen the other one's eyes. The Chosen were only people. Learning that lesson had stunned Thalion too, but some refused to learn. The Chosen were vastly stronger, infinitely more knowledgeable, and quite possibly they had already received the reward of immortality, but by all evidence they schemed and fought each other as hard as two Murandians with one blanket. Ispan's shock quickly gave way to anger. There are others looking. Would they all look for nothing? There are friends of the dark looking. They must have been sent by others of the Chosen. If the Chosen look, can you still say there is nothing? She would not see. If a thing could not be found, the
Can't
most
really
obvious
see it in
reason
here,
was that
but
it was not there. Thalion waited.
it's a
Ispan was not stupid,
tropical
only
grape.
awestruck, and Thalion did believe in making people teach
This
themselves
is
what they should already be aware of.
Blinkers.
Lazy minds needed to
There's
be
a vape
exercised.
company, or the company that
Ispan
puts these
paced,
out.
swishing her skirts
They're
and frowning
definitely
at the dust and old cobwebs.
they're definitely
This place
beasts on
smells.
hits.
And it is filthy.
You definitely
She
don't want
shuddered
to
as a large black
hit
cockroach
it like
went
a regular
skittering up the
vape,
wall. The glow
because
surrounded
they'll
her for a
hurt you
moment.
if you're not
A
careful.
flow squashed the beetle with a popping sound. Making a face, Ispan wiped her hands on her skirts as if she had used them instead
That
of
was
the
a little
power.
hit.
She had a delicate stomach, though fortunately not when she could remove herself from the actual deed. I will not report the failure to one of the chosen, Thalion. She would make us envy Luanda. Thalion did not quite shiver. She did, however, cross the basement and pour herself a cup of plum punch. The plums had been cooled and the punch was too sweet, but her hands remained steady. Fear of Mogedion was perfectly sensible, but yielding to fear was not. Perhaps the woman was dead. She would have summoned them by now else, or snatched them sleeping into Tel'aran'rhiod again to tell her why they had not yet carried out her commands. Until she saw a body, though, the only logical choice was to continue as if Mogedion would appear any moment.
Sure,
There was a
anyone's
way.
welcome.
How? Put every wise woman in Ebudar to the question? How many are there? 100? 200, perhaps? The sisters in the Tarasen Palace, they would notice this, I think. Forget your dreams of owning a Saangreal, Ispan. There is no long-hidden storehouse, no secret basement beneath a palace. Thalion spoke in
As long as you come here to
measured tones,
chill
perhaps more measured the more agitated
and
Ispan
relax,
became.
then
She'd always
all's
enjoyed
welcome.
mesmerizing a class of novices with the sound of her voice. Almost all of the wise men are others, highly unlikely to know what we wish to learn. No wilder has ever been found keeping an Angreal, much less a Saangreal, and they surely would have been found. On the contrary, by every record, a wilder who discovers any object ties to the power rids herself of it as soon as possible for fear of attracting the wrath of the White Tower. Women who are put out of the tower, on the other hand, seem not to have the same fear. As you well know, when they are searched before leaving, fully 1 in 3 has secreted something about her person, an actual object of the power or something she believes is one. Of the few wise women who qualified present, Callie was the perfect choice. When she was put out 4 years ago, she tried to create a small Turangreal, a useless thing that makes images of flowers and the sound of a waterfall, but still an object tied to Saidar. And she tried to discover all the other novices' secrets, succeeding more often than not. If there was even a single Angreal in Ebudar, not to speak of a vast storehouse, do you think she could have been 4 years here without locating it? I do wear the shawl, Thalion, Ispan said with extraordinary asperity, and I do know all of that as well as you. You said there was another way. What way? She simply would not apply her brain. What would please Mogedion as greatly as the cash? Ispan simply stared at her, tapping her foot. Nynaeve Almira, Ispan. Mogedion abandoned us to go chasing after her, but obviously she escaped somehow. If we give Nynaeve, and the Trakand girl for that matter, to Mogedion, she would forgive us 100 Saangreal. which clearly demonstrated that the chosen could be irrational, of course. It was best, of course, to be extremely careful so that you were both irrational and more powerful than you. Ispan was not more powerful. We should have killed her as I wanted when she first appeared, she spat. Waving her hands, she stalked up and down, grime crunching loudly beneath her slippers. Yes, yes, I know. Our sisters in the palace, they might have become suspicious. We do not wish to draw their eyes. But have you forgotten Tanchico and Tyr? Where those two girls appear, disaster follows. I think if we cannot kill them, we should remain as far from Nynaeve, Almira, and Elaine Trakand as we can. As far as we can. Calm yourself, Ispan. Calm yourself. If anything, Thalian's soothing tone only seemed to agitate the other woman more. But Thalian was confident. Logic must prevail over emotion.
Sitting on an upended barrel in the sparse coolness of a narrow, shaded alley, he studied the house across the busy street. Suddenly he realized he was touching his head again. He did not have a headache, but his head felt peculiar sometimes. Most often when he thought of what he could not remember. 3 stories of white plaster. The house belonged to a goldsmith who supposedly was being visited by 2 friends she had met on a journey north some years ago. The friends had only been glimpsed on arrival and not seen since. Finding that out had been easy. Finding out they were Aes Sedai, only a trifle more difficult. A lean young man in a torn vest, whistling his way down the street with no good on his mind, paused when he glimpsed him sitting on the barrel. His coat and his location in the shadows, and the rest of him, he admitted ruefully, probably looked tempting. He reached under his coat. His hands no longer possessed the strength or flexibility for sword work, but the 2 long knives he had carried for well over 30 years had surprised more than one swordsman. Maybe something showed in his eyes, because the lean young man thought of it and whistled his way on. Beside the house, the gate that led back to the goldsmith's stable swung open, and 2 burly men appeared, pushing a barrow piled high with soiled straw and muck. What were they up to? Arnon and Nad were hardly the lads to be mucking out the stables. He would stay here until dark, he decided, then see whether he could find Carden's pretty little killer again. Once again, he pulled his hand down from his head. Sooner or later, he would remember. He did not have much time left, but it was all he did have. He remembered that much. Chapter 18. As the Plow Breaks the Earth. Seizing Saidin long enough to unknot the ward he had woven across one corner of the anteroom, he raised his small silver cup and said, "More tea." Bruce stared painfully in the back of his head. Carved chairs, heavy with gilt, stood in paired lines on either side of a golden rostrum, 2 paces wide, set into the polished stone floor, and another tall chair so gilded it seemed entirely gold topped a small dais that was just as elaborate. But he sat cross-legged on a carpet spread for the occasion, green and gold and blue in a Tyran maze. The 3 clan chiefs seated across from him would have disliked him receiving them from the chair, even if they were offered their own. They were another maze, he trod on warily. He was in his shirt, sleeves pushed up his forearms to expose the red and gold dragon that curled around each, glittering metallically. The Aielman's cotton sword covered theirs, on the left arm alone. Perhaps the reminder of who he was, that he too had been to Roidion when the journey meant death for most men who entered. Perhaps it was unnecessary. Those 3 faces gave away little as they watched Marana come from the corner where she had been sealed off. Janwin's creased face could have been carved from old wood, but it always looked that way, and if his blue-gray eyes seemed stormy, so did they always too. Even his hair looked like storm clouds. He was an even-tempered man, though. Indirian and one-eyed Mandalane might have been thinking of something else, except that their unblinking gazes followed her. Luz Theron suddenly went silent, as if he too watched through Rand's eyes. Marana's ageless features revealed even less than the clan chief's. Smoothing her pale gray skirts under, she knelt beside Rand and lifted the teapot. A massive ball of gold-washed silver, with leopards for feet and handle, and another crouched on the lid. It required both of her hands, and wavered a little as she carefully filled Rand's cup. Her manner seemed to say she did this because she wanted to, for reasons of her own that none of them could understand. Her manner shouted Aes Sedai louder than her face did. Was that to the good or the
I
bad?
get hurt.
I do not allow them to
Still
channel
recovering
without
from it.
permission, he said. The clan chiefs kept silent. Marana rose and moved to kneel beside each in turn. Mandelaine covered his cup with a broad hand to indicate he wanted no more. The other two held out theirs, blue-gray eyes and green alike, studying her. What did they see? What more could he do? Replacing the heavy teapot on the thick, leopard-handled tray, she remained on her knees. May I serve my Lord Dragon in any way else? Her voice was self-possession itself, but after he motioned her back to her corner, after she had risen and turned, slim hands clutched at her skirts for an instant. Yet that might have been because turning brought her to face Dashiva and Narishima. The two
I'll be
Ashaman,
right back,
to be
everyone.
precise, Narishima was still only a soldier, the lowest level of Ashaman, with neither the sword nor the dragon on his collar. The Ashaman stood impassively between two of the tall, golden-framed mirrors that lined the walls. At least, the younger man looked impassive at first glance. Thumbs tucked behind his sword belt, he ignored Marana and paid little more attention to Rand or the Aielman. Yet at a second glance, you saw that his dark, too big eyes never rested, as if he expected the unexpected to leap out of the air any moment. And who could say it would not? Dashiva appeared to have his head in the clouds, his lips moved soundlessly, and he blinked and frowned at nothing. Luz Theron snarled when Rand looked at the Ashaman, but it was Marana who occupied the dead man inside Rand's head. Only a fool thinks a lion or a woman can truly be tamed. Irritably, Rand suppressed the voice to a muted buzz. Luz Theron could break through, but not without effort. Grabbing hold of Saidin, he rewove the ward that shut Marana away from their voices. Releasing the source again increased his irritation, the hissing in his head, the water drops on red coals. An echo pulsing in time with Luz Theron's mad, distant rage. Marana stood behind the barrier she could neither see nor feel, head high and hands folded at her waist, as if a shawl were looped over her arms. Aes Sedai to her toenails. She watched him and the clan chiefs with cool eyes, light brown, flecked with yellow. Do not all realize how very much we need you, she had told them this morning in this very room. But all of us who swore will do whatever you ask. That would not violate the 3 oaths. He had just wakened when she came with Soralia escorting her. Neither seemed to care at all that he was still in a robe, with only one bite taken from his breakfast bread. I have more than a little skill in negotiation and mediation. My sisters have other skills. Let us serve you as we pledged. Let me serve you. We need you, but you have some need of us, too. Ever present, Ilana lay nestled in a corner of his brain. She was weeping again. He could not understand why she wept so often. He had forbidden her to come near him unless summoned, or leave her room without an escort of maidens. The sisters who had sworn to him had been found rooms last night in the palace where he could keep an eye on them. But he had sensed tears from the moment she bonded him. Tears and a raw grief like being ripped by claws. Sometimes it was less, sometimes more. Yet always there. Ilana also had told him he needed the sworn sisters, screamed it at him finally, with her face red and tears rolling down her cheeks, before literally running from his presence. And she had spoken of serving too, though he doubted that Marana's present tasks were what either had in mind. Perhaps some sort of livery would make it clear? The clan chiefs watched Marana watch them. Not so much as the flicker of an eyelash betrayed their thoughts. The wise ones have told you where the Aes Sedai stand, Rand said bluntly. Soralea had told them they knew, but the fact would have been clear from the lack of surprise when they first saw Marana fetch and curtsy. You've seen her bring the tray and pour your tea. You've seen her come and go as I say. If you want, I'll have her dance a jig. Convincing the Aiel that he was not on the end of an Aes Sedai leash was the most needed service any of the sisters could do him right now. He would have them all doing jigs if necessary. Mandelaine adjusted the gray-green patch over his right eye, the way he did when he wanted a moment to think. A thick, puckered scar ran up his forehead from behind the leather patch and halfway across his mostly bald head. When he finally spoke, it was only a little less blunt than Rand. Some say an Aes Sedai will do anything to have what she wants. Indirian lowered heavy white brows and peered down his long nose at his tea. Of only average height for an Aielman, he was shorter than Rand by half a hand, yet everything about him seemed long. The heat of the waist appeared to have melted away every spare ounce of flesh, and a few more besides. His cheekbones stood out sharp, and his eyes were emeralds set in caves. I do not like speaking of Aes Sedai. His deep, rich voice was always a shock coming from that gaunt face. What is done is done. Let the wise ones deal with them. Better to speak of the Shido dogs, Jenwyn said mildly, which was almost as great a shock coming from his fierce face. Within a few months, less than half a year at most, every Shido who can be will be dead or made Gaishain. Just because his voice was soft did not mean he was. The other two nodded. Mandelaine smiled eagerly. They still seemed unconvinced. The Shido had been the professed reason for this meeting, and no less important for not being the most important. Not unimportant, the Shido had made trouble long enough, just not on the same page with the Aes Sedai in his book. They did present problems, though. 3 clans joining Timolin's Miagoma, already near Kinslayer's Dagger, might well be able to do as Jenwyn said, but there were those who could not be made Gaishain and could not be killed. Some were more critical than others. What of the wise ones? He asked. For a moment, their faces became unreadable. Not even Aes Sedai could do that so well as Aiel. Facing the One Power did not frighten them, not where it showed at least. No one could outrun death, so Aiel believed, and 100 Aes Sedai in a rage could not make a lone Aiel lower the veil once raised. But learning that wise ones had taken part in the fighting at Dumai's Wells had hit them like watching the sun rise by night and the moon by day in a blood-red sky. Sarinda tells me almost all of the wise ones will run with the Algaid Siswai, Indirian said at last, reluctantly. Sarinda was the wise one who had followed him from Red Springs, clanhold of the Kodara. Or perhaps followed was not the right word. Wise ones seldom did. In any case, most of the Kodara wise ones, and the Shianda, and the Daraim, would go north with the spears. The Shido wise ones will be dealt with by wise ones. His mouth twisted with disgust. All things change. Jenwyn's voice was even softer than usual. He believed, but he did not want to. Wise ones taking part in battle violated custom as old as the Aiel. Mandelaine set his cup down with exaggerated care. Corahwin wishes to see Jer again before the dream ends, and so do I. Like Bael and Ruark, he had 2 wives. The other chiefs had only 1 each, except Timlin. But a widowed chief seldom remained so long. The wise one saw to that if he did not. Will any of us ever see the sun rise again in the threefold land? I hope so, Rand said slowly. As the plow breaks the earth, shall he break the lives of men, and all that was shall be consumed in the fire of his eyes. The trumpets of war shall sound at his footsteps, the ravens feed at his voice, and you shall wear a crown of swords. The prophecies of the dragon gave little hope for anything except victory over the Dark One, and only a chance of that. The prophecy of Rodion, the Aiel prophecy, said he would destroy them. The bleakness swept through the clans because of him, and ancient customs were ripped apart. Even without the Aes Sedai, small wonder.
Alright, everyone, I'm going to call into this stream for tonight. But I want to thank everyone stopping by, and everyone continues to stop by. I definitely appreciate all y'all's support. Until next time, everyone, y'all stay safe out there.